Hello and welcome to the latest edition of The Shindig, an archaeology podcast brought to you by the Red River Archaeology Group. I'm your usual co-host, Dr. Tom Horn, and I'm joined as ever by...
the other co-host, Luke Barry, the producer, the best-looking podcaster in archaeology. You know, these titles.
I mean, I would say you're in the top two, but moving on to what we're here to discuss and what you guys are here to listen to, which is another fantastic archaeology podcast, even if we do say so ourselves. Today we've got a real treat for you. We're going to discuss a fantastic book that's being released next week. Luke, could you tell us a bit about that?
Places for the Living, Places for the Dead, Archaeological Discoveries on the N25 New Ross Bypass, which was edited by James Eogan and James Hession, who are our guests here today.
Yes, so James Hession was once of this parish, and James Eogan is a senior archaeologist for Transport Infrastructure Ireland. So to get the two editors in for this podcast is fantastic because I've done a bit of editing myself. It's a tough job. I'll tell you that. But you get an overview like nothing else. You know every paragraph in that book. So if you're wanting an overview, which is the kind of thing I think you want from an archaeology podcast, in the next hour or so, that's what you're going to get. You're going to get an insight into thousands of years. We're going to go back into the Mesolithic. We're going to spend time at one of the first Neolithic house of its type that was discovered in the region that we'll be talking about today. And there's amazing firsts to come with that in the medieval period as well. It's packed full in terms of the book. It's packed in terms of the podcast. We had a great time. The illustrations are fantastic. So if you're on the YouTube version of this, you'll see some of the fantastic illustrations, great photographs taken by James Eogan as well that are also in the book. And there's more to come, and we'll tell people in future about the other offerings that are going to be connected with this amazing infrastructure project and the brilliant archaeology that's been brought with it.
So let's get to the interview with James Eogan and James Hession.
Thanks, guys, for joining us today. I know you're both extremely busy, so we do genuinely really appreciate Luke and I joining us on the Shindig here today. And we're talking about the archaeological work that was done in relation to the New Ross Bypass for the N25, and specifically the wonderful book that's just been released, Places for the Living and Places for the Dead. And with all these podcasts, well, I like to sort of start with a bit of background, whether it's historical or in terms of the work that was done on the project in terms of its archaeology. So what I'd like to do with this one specifically is just what did we kind of know about the area where the road was going in and where the archaeological project was as well prior to this bypass going in? Sort of, were there any knowledge gaps that we had? Were there any ages that we just didn't have too much information about? And yeah, I'll start with James Eogan on this, but feel free just to answer as and when.
Thanks, Tom, and looks great to be here to have the opportunity to chat about Places for the Living and Places for the Dead. So the background, like obviously we're talking about a project that is located in Southeast Ireland. And I suppose Southeast Ireland, from an archaeological perspective, might be perceived as being a bit of a kind of a backwater. It hasn't been an area that has seen, big campaigns of research or excavation in comparison, let's say, to the Boyne Valley or to, West Munster or Northwest Connacht, other better known areas from an archaeological perspective in Ireland. But yeah, it is an area that is notable from an archaeological historical point of view, particularly relating to the Anglo-Norman colonization in the 12th and 13th centuries. So I suppose locally, the most significant archaeological complex in the New Ross area is the medieval town of New Ross itself, which was founded by William Marshall and Isabella de Clare. otherwise, in terms of kind of archaeological knowledge, most of our knowledge before this bypass was built came from, stray finds, archaeological objects, whether they be, stone axes or, Bronze Age metalwork. Some Bronze Age burial sites were known in the locality, and there were also some upstanding monuments, like a very fine portal tomb in Glencloughley, just on the Kilkenny side of the River Barrow. And standing stones, Fullochthia, and lots of evidence for ring forts. And in fact, this part of Wexford in the early medieval period, so ring forts are the typical enclosed farmsteads associated with the early medieval period in Ireland. And there's a notable concentration of ring forts, both upstanding but also recorded from historic cartographic sources and aerial photographs and satellite imagery and so on in the kind of the broader New Ross region. So that, I suppose, summarizes the archaeological background. And I suppose topographically, the most significant feature, of course, is the River Barrow itself, which flows through the middle of the project and had to be bridged by the project. And of course, the Barrow not only is a dominant topographic feature, but also created the environmental conditions that were suitable or attractive for settlement, and also provided a routeway right through prehistory and historic times. So that's the kind of the broad background.
Thank you very much. And James Hession, just anything on that in terms of, your interest in the area and what you knew going into this project and ultimately producing.
Yeah, I suppose it's pretty much very well summed up there by James. I suppose I didn't have too much prior knowledge going into the project, bar the fact that I suppose any of the excavations that would have been carried out would have been in New Ross town itself. So again, it was kind of the hinterland where there was kind of a lack of information, or that we wouldn't have had information from archaeological excavation per se. So yeah, I suppose the fact that the route was going kind of through the hinterlands of New Ross provided a great opportunity to discover more about, we'll say, prehistoric and medieval time periods.
And you said medieval time periods as well. And I'd like to ask James Eogan a bit about because transport in the area is kind of always been important. I mean, it's easy to say that, but the bridge at New Ross and crossing the Barrow is always been really key to that area. And obviously, this project was trying to solve some modern traffic problems that were an issue with essentially a sort of almost like a medieval or a Victorian infrastructure. How could you tell us a little bit about this, the history, a sense of bridging and getting across this Barrow Valley? And again, starting with James Eogan.
So I suppose what we know from, let's say, early medieval times is that the River Barrow in the vicinity of what we now call New Ross was crossed by one of the 5 great kind of routeways in early medieval Ireland, the Sliabh Cualann, which extended, from South County Dublin down through, Wicklow and Carlow, and came down effectively the east side, I suppose, of the Barrow, and then crossed the Barrow, as I say, in the vicinity of what is now known as New Ross. We've no knowledge of what the nature of that crossing was, if it was a fording point or if it was a ferry. The River Barrow is tidal up beyond New Ross, so there could have been some sort of a sandbank exposed at low water or something potentially that could have been used as a crossing point. But we just don't have any knowledge, and we don't even know the precise location where that early routeway crossed the Barrow. But it did become the focus, I suppose, for the establishment of the early medieval ecclesiastical site or monastery by St. Abon. in maybe the 6th or 7th century AD. When William Marshall and Isabella de Clare established the town of New Ross, in the early 1200s, one of the pieces of infrastructure that they built was a wooden bridge to cross the river to give them access to the very extensive lands that they controlled, particularly in South Kilkenny, on the east side of the Barrow. And indeed, in documentary sources at that time, the bridge, or the name of the town, is connected to the presence of the bridge, which I suppose indicates the significance of the bridge as a piece of infrastructure. And over the subsequent, 8 centuries, there were a number of different bridges that existed at New Ross. Right down to the bridge that was built in the late 1960s in the middle of the town, the O'Hanrahan Bridge. And, that bridge was sufficient for traffic, I suppose, our traffic volumes in the late 1960s, but by the early 2000s, it was clear that it was too narrow to accommodate the modern flows and volumes of traffic travelling east and west on the N25 road, which links Rosslare, Europort to Cork and to other significant places in Munster and South Leinster. So not only did the narrowness of the bridge and the fact that it was the only crossing point accommodating both through traffic and locally generated traffic, that created traffic jams and tailbacks and so on, but also environmentally, it was far from ideal for the town of New Ross, because there were long tailbacks of vehicles, belching fumes, sitting on the quays, or, backed up through the medieval streets of the town. So that was a very significant, aspect or issue that the design of the new bypass, or that the new bypass was designed to eliminate. Was to improve the environment in New Ross town, and also improve, the travel times and safety of road users, both, in cars, but also particularly vulnerable road users, pedestrians and so on in the town of New Ross. So to take all the HGVs and the other through traffic out of the medieval town and off its medieval and 18th century quays.
That's brilliant. I think most people have experiences of roads being built to alleviate conditions, particularly in Western and Northern Europe, with the sort of the medieval footprints of the cities. So that, I think, that's something fairly universal that a lot of people will understand, particularly with new infrastructure projects. So like all good answers, it's answered some of my next question about the funding, and then what I want to ask both of you, and maybe starting with James Hession, where commercial archaeology comes into this in terms of when the funding has been given and the decisions politically have been made to do it. I really want to get into what commercial archaeology really sort of gives to a society in terms that it well planned in advance of major infrastructure works, that it can really pay for itself in terms of the heritage and that we learn about. So maybe James Hession and then James Eogan, just starting on essentially that phase between the funding being in and then these preparatory works, and to avoid the archaeology that's known to be there, and then sort of mitigate for any archaeology that may be found subsequent to that. So James Hession.
Sure, yeah. Well, I suppose when any route is being planned, the first thing to do is to have a look at what constraints might be in that area. So at that planning stage, a constraints kind of study was carried out, which progressed into kind of a route kind of selection report to kind of identify the most optimum route for the road. And during that process, a lot of work is carried out to identify all of the archaeological, architectural, and cultural heritage receptors in the area that might be impacted by the route of the road. And then it's a matter really for, I suppose, those looking at the decision to see which is the optimal route, not only in terms of archaeology, but economic factors as well. To pick a route that is kind of the least disruptive or that won't impact on a substantial amount of sites. And by carrying out the constraint study, you kind of get to identify all of the known sites within probably a 90 square meter area of the route of the road. So that, I suppose, the route that's eventually selected or decided upon is kind of one that possibly avoids kind of topographic extremes where we know archaeological settlements will be present. And it's at that stage then, I suppose, that once that final route is selected, that the commercial side of it, or the side that Rubicon were involved in, where we were commissioned to carry out the archaeological test trenching along the route, and with TII policy on that with regards to carrying out test excavation on 12% of the route. It's a tried and tested method of identifying where the sites are effectively, and then the next stages of mitigation can be put forward, as in how do we actually deal and manage with those sites. So that's kind of an overview of kind of the process involved, and at the start then for the test excavations to begin on the ground. And
James Eogan, then, from James talking about the commercial archaeology side of things, what's the TII once you funded a project, what's or you're planning it, I should say, what's the philosophy about archaeology? And obviously, but these projects are going to work for the people and they've got to work for the transport as well. So just maybe a little bit about that stage, this earliest stage for TII.
So I suppose the thing is that we're guided by the ministerial policy, and the ministerial policy in Ireland, our government policy, is to minimise impacts on archaeological, architectural and cultural heritage by avoidance. So if we can design out, if we can identify a sensitive site or a receptor, like James said earlier, if we can identify those early enough, the engineers then have the opportunity to design a road which avoids impacting on them. That's the basic principle that we apply in terms of our approach to designing new roads. However, we know not only from prior road projects, but also other types of infrastructure development, like gas pipelines or electricity cable transmission networks, housing and industrial development, and so on, that the documented heritage sites in any given area are only a fraction of the sites where people have lived or carried out activities or buried their dead in their past. And this is because many sites were not built of durable materials. They were built of wood or clay and other organic materials which don't survive or don't leave any above ground trace, in contrast, let's say, to a castle or a church or some very substantial structure. So when it comes to then, once a route has been approved, I suppose our focus switches from avoiding the known sites to identifying those previously undocumented sites. And this isn't, for the purpose of kind of archaeological prospection, or this is unlike an archaeological research project, you might say, that a research institution or a college or a university might carry out, because obviously, we're constrained by the route that has been identified for the new road, and we're constrained by the boundary of the lands that have been acquired for the construction of the new road. So our work is very closely, or I suppose is restricted in terms of its spatial extent to the footprint of the development. And yet we know from those other types of developments that have taken place that, in Southeast Ireland, as a rule of thumb, we know we will find at least one previously undocumented significant archaeological site every 500 meters of new road. So our aim in terms of the archaeological assessment phase of the project, when we go, or when the archaeological companies that we employ go out into the field and start digging test trenches, is to design a test trench layout that will maximize the chances of us finding those sites, and therefore reduce the risk to the subsequent construction phases, because it's far preferable, both from an archaeological point of view and from a construction point of view, that we identify those sites early in the process, so that they aren't found during construction. Because if archaeological remains are found during construction, that creates risk for the project, and also can delay a project and add to the costs. And I suppose it's worth bearing in mind, that at the design phase, we do a lot of work in terms of research, looking at historic mapping, looking at aerial and satellite imagery, carrying out geophysical surveys, in what might be identified as high risk or high potential areas, and so on. But some of that non-invasive work also takes place at the investigative stage after the approval of the road. So, for instance, in New Ross, we did carry out some geophysical surveys, of particular locations in advance of carrying out the test excavations. So we try and use as many different avenues or investigative techniques that we can to ensure that we carry out a comprehensive assessment of the footprint of the road that's going to be built.
And Luke, I think the point to take us there, if you and I ever partake in a major infrastructure project by ourselves, to make it a maximum of 499 meters, and then we're less likely to discover a major, just to be on the safe side. So, but thank you very much.
There, actually, before,
yeah, you may, of course.
That statistic was really interesting. The one every 500 meters. I guess my question is, when you're coming at a project like this, does the idea of all, I suppose, the paperwork and the technical aspect of it, does that ever leave your mind, and do you get that enjoyment and that excitement about finding archaeology? Is that still there at that level, or do you get overwhelmed by the paperwork of it all?
I suppose it like testing is actually a very exciting stage of kind of any road scheme, in my opinion, anyway, because you're out on the ground. You're at the blade of the machine, so you're there when the discoveries are made. So it is quite an exciting time, but I suppose it is a bit of a war of attrition as well, because you need to kind of keep everything moving and kind of manage a team of people and plant moving across the landscape, or multiple teams of people and plant. So it's a fine balance of being excited by the discoveries and also making sure that you have enough resources in place to record the sites, investigate them, and report on them. But yeah, it is a really exciting time for an archaeologist in the field. That initial kind of testing phase is wonderful. Yeah.
And I suppose to add, sorry, Tom.
Go on. Yeah,
it's also a great opportunity to meet, landowners and people who have been, farming, let's say, these lands, because typically the lands that are acquired for road construction are agricultural lands. And often those people who have an intimate knowledge of the area, have useful insights in terms of both the kind of the differing quality, let's say, of the land that we're investigating. Whether an area is particularly boggy, or whether a certain area is very fertile ground or whatever. And even sometimes, they have stories of, finds that were made previously, whether they might be stone axes, or that, when they were plowing, they found, a spread of, charcoal and heat shattered stone, somewhere in the locality, which may not have been previously documented, but it's from that kind of engagement and interaction with the local people that we also, make discoveries and get deeper insights, I suppose, into the route that the bypass was passing through.
Yeah, I mean, look, from Scottish Vikingist as well, and a lot of major discoveries are found when an archaeologist happens to having a cup of tea with the farmer, and they pull something out of the kitchen drawer that their grandparents found, things like that. And they're like, oh, so no, I think that's a really interesting point there about there's a lot of local knowledge, but the brilliant opportunity people get when these major projects come through in areas, they can suddenly, it can trigger a memory or say, oh yes, we remember, or that field was called XY and that's related to this find now, and it makes sense. Places called the Fields of Silver, and then you discover a Viking hoard there sort of a generation later. So there's a lot of sort of folk memory is probably the wrong word for it, but that's the thing. There's a lot of local knowledge, a lot of local interest in history and people's heritage as well. And I think these projects are brilliant because they allow that to come out. Now, I think the other exciting thing to talk about then is we're in this test excavation phase then. How many new sites did you find at that phase, and how many did you think or know at that stage potentially, as James Eogan was saying earlier, could be significant? So James Hession first on that, and then James Eogan on that afterwards.
Yeah, I think between the two phases of test trenching, the first carried out in kind of the end of 2009, 2010. And the subsequent phase in 2013, I think there was 33 sites were found along the route. So I suppose it's from the initial kind of testing phase, it's kind of difficult enough to know the extent of those sites until you get into the kind of the subsequent phases where you go back into the sites that have been identified and strip the topsoil from the sites under strict archaeological supervision and engage in kind of the next phase to identify the extent of those sites that are found. But certainly, when you come across a burnt mound, it's pretty obvious. You've got your heat shattered stone, so you can kind of see the extent of the site within the kind of test trenches. But maybe something like the Neolithic house at Ryleen 2. Where you just have a small bit of a slot trench and maybe some packing stones that are visible going across the trench. It isn't until maybe you come across a piece of pottery that you can kind of maybe identify what kind of site you might be looking at in that particular instance. Or certainly something like the cremation cemeteries that were found in Berkeley and Cameron. You're going to come across small kind of circular shaped pits in the ground filled with kind of cremated bone and charcoal. So you kind of automatically know you're looking at a cremation burial. But then the next question is, well, how far does this extend within the land take of the route of the scheme? So it's I suppose it's just from that initial phase of identifying those sites and then to kind of put together a report on those findings and to go into the next phase of stripping that topsoil and actually getting in to investigate the sites and seeing exactly what you're dealing with. But you certainly have a reasonable idea from that initial test trenching phase of the kind of type of sites you're looking at, but of course not always.
And thanks for that, James. And I suppose then the next question that follows from that is, James Eogan, when you start getting a James Hession saying, oh, we found 33 plus sites, I suppose that's a cause for celebration, but then that's where, the commercial unit and the TII then really have to work together and make these decisions, if I'm correct, on, how to then handle the next stage of mitigation, how to protect the archaeology and record it. Would that be correct to say that?
Yeah, so I suppose it's not down to either TII or Rubicon or any other commercial consultancy company in Ireland, in that we have a very regulated system for archaeological excavation here in Ireland. And so it's the National Monument Service and the Minister with responsibility for archaeological heritage under the National Monuments Act, as well as who's the relevant authority or regulatory authority, I suppose, for archaeological excavation. So the team from Rubicon go out and they do all the hard work in terms of digging the trenches and investigating suspected archaeological features that are identified in the course of that work. And then they do the equally hard work and equally important work of compiling a comprehensive report. And that report, and that's all done under license in Ireland. And that report then is submitted to the National Monument Service. And, in that report, there are proposals contained within the report for how these archaeological remains will be, or how the impact on them will be mitigated. And in most cases, the only appropriate mitigation at this stage in a project is excavation to preserve by record. It's rarely feasible to preserve archaeological remains in situ. The practicalities of preservation in situ are very difficult once the boundaries of a road scheme have been defined and lands have been acquired, because oftentimes it would require acquiring additional lands and so on, and reopening the planning aspect of it. So in most cases, the recommendations are for excavation to mitigate the impact of the road through excavation. And that report is then submitted to the National Monument Service, and the recommendations in the report are evaluated by them, and we'll generally discuss the recommendations. And once the National Monument Service are happy that what has been proposed is appropriate from an archaeological point of view, and that we have all the necessary resources in place, not just staff and machinery and plant, but also relevant specialists. So for instance, if there's a site that contains human remains, it's important that an osteoarchaeologist be part of the team. If there's a potential for vulnerable archaeological objects to be found, well then we have to make sure that we have a conservator available on call, and so on. So once the National Monument Service gives us the green light, I suppose, to move to the next stage, well then things ramp up in terms of the number of people on site and the intensity of work at a selected number of locations. So in other words, those areas that have been identified as a result of the test trenching, to contain archaeological remains that require excavation to preserve them.
And now I think we get to the point in the podcast where we can talk about what was found. And I think probably the best way to do it, that makes more sense, is to do it and just from Mesolithic onwards. So that's my first question to both of you. Of prehistoric stuff, do we get anything really early? Do we get anything from the Mesolithic in the sites? And if so, maybe just an example of a particularly interesting find from that earliest sort of phase. So I don't know if James Hession wants to start on that. And James Eogan.
Start off there. I suppose so. The earliest findings on the scheme were from the Mesolithic period. Just as Riley 2, we came across two kind of curvilinear features, both along kind of the same alignment, but they returned a date back to the Mesolithic period. But the other findings really, I think there was a flint blade found at the adjacent Neolithic house site, but that was believed to be a repurposed kind of blade that would have been in use in the Mesolithic. And the other area was in Arnestown townland, where a church blade was recovered from one of the features there. And I suppose the there's, I suppose, a paucity of Mesolithic sites in Ireland in general, most likely because of their kind of coastal or riverine locations, and with the rising of the waters, coastal waters, after the last ice age. A lot of those sites are now flooded, so we don't actually we don't come across them, we don't access them. So any kind of sites that are found that date to the Mesolithic period are generally considered important. And I suppose the location of where we came across the Mesolithic findings kind of is in around the kind of the Modlin stream. So in that kind of area, I suppose it would have provided an attractive area for hunter-gatherers to settle, because you would have had abundant resources with the river location. You'd also have kind of, I suppose, a mode of transport. So that's kind of our earliest findings, although they're not, we'll say, no evidence of, we'll say, house structures or hut-type structures were identified. There's still evidence that there was a Mesolithic population active in the area, and in around this part of Southeast Ireland.
Can I ask a question on that there?
Yeah, go on.
You mentioned a repurposed blade. How do you come to the conclusions or to the answers that has been repurposed?
I suppose it's because the type of blade that was found is kind of typical of the Mesolithic period. So flint tools would have been, I suppose, crafted in a certain type of way, or struck in a certain type of way. So they're characteristic of the Mesolithic period. But the Mesolithic site at Riley 2 was, I suppose, just kind of to the north of the Neolithic house. And I suppose we encountered that flint artifact amongst the Neolithic house, but essentially it seems to be an artifact that the Neolithic settlement that they used that or came across it and reused it or repurposed it for their own daily activities.
Yeah, James Eogan.
It's worth considering that in terms of what we understand about the Mesolithic in Ireland is that population densities were really, really low at this time, and so finding evidence for Mesolithic activity is the proverbial finding the needle in the haystack sort of thing. And what's very interesting is that the finds that the Rubicon team made absolutely fit into the kind of the pattern of the discovery of Mesolithic remains, in much of lowland Ireland. So, as James mentioned, the fact that Mesolithic artifacts were found, close to the Magdalen stream, or kind of in the valley of the Magdalen stream, is absolutely typical. A small little tributary of a larger river. And we have to think that in the Mesolithic period we had these mobile groups of hunter-gatherers, fishers, moving through the landscape on a seasonal basis. But the very significant thing about that period is, of course, it is the period when we first get people making places in the landscape. And so I suppose to refer back to the title of the book, Place for the Living and Place for the Dead, these people that left, their tools or that lost their tools at Ryleen or Arnestown, or who dug those narrow little trenches at Ryleen, that's evidence for the first placemaking in this landscape. So it's a really significant discovery, even though the remains themselves maybe aren't very impressive, or is only a small number of actual objects. So the Mesolithic period is when people first begin to explore this landscape, which is largely which is a wild landscape, of course, up to then, heavily wooded. The evidence from pollen cores would suggest, and as they went through that landscape, they will have, gathered the bounty of nature. They will have hunted animals in the woodlands. They will have fished in the River Barrow and its tributaries, but also they will have altered the landscape as they went, and so they will have probably encouraged certain types of plants to grow in favorable locations by selectively, cutting other plants back or whatever. They may have used fire to create clearings, which might then have encouraged, let's say, grass to grow, which would have brought grazing animals into a clearing where they would be easier to hunt. And certainly, we know from other road projects, they for instance, used basketry to make fish traps to catch fish, in the rivers, streams, and lakes in the landscape. So it's a really important phase of the prehistory of the New Ross area, even though we only have very kind of I suppose tentative signals for human presence in the landscape at that time.
Okay, look, I'm just going to ask you to make a note now. We're going to do a podcast on the Mesolithic in Ireland. I think I'm hooked, like a fish in a fish trap. I'm in on that. Yeah, thanks, guys, for that. That's as I say, something I'm interested in. But yeah, the Mesolithic and Paleolithic is obviously just very rare. So it's very exciting when projects do find evidence for that. But in talking about excitement, the kind of flash new Stone Age, the Neolithic find is one that I want to talk about now, and it's this first, well, I think one's been discovered subsequently, but the first Neolithic house that was identified in County Wexford, thanks to this project. So I don't know who wants to start. I'll start again with James Hession on this. Could you tell us a little bit about this fantastic find of this Neolithic house and what it tells us about everyday life, how it tells us that Neolithic life is changing from the Mesolithic period and just its regional importance as a find?
Yeah, so the house at Riley 2 there was, as you said, Tom, the first Neolithic house found in County Wexford, and this is, direct evidence of the first farmers in Ireland in Wexford, and the first people to introduce agriculture. We're talking about woodlands being cleared and the cultivation of crops. So to find the structure was actually an amazing find, and I suppose the Neolithic and Neolithic houses themselves are kind of characterized by they all seem to have a similar ground plan or a similar footprint. So they're no matter what part of the country that you come across Neolithic houses, they all seem to be of that kind of rectangular structure, and quite often there's evidence for internal division within that structure. So at Riley, we were looking at kind of a two-roomed kind of house where we've got definitely one kind of area at the northwestern end and another area at the southeastern end of the house. I suppose it was kind of characterized really by I suppose a kind of a foundation trench that had evidence for split plank posts and other posts, and I suppose the construction would have been from those kind of split planks and posts, and probably some sort of, I suppose, wattle screening, and that would have been held in place within that trench by a series of packing stones. So like at all of the corners of the structure, we came across a substantial amount of stone which would have held those kind of posts in place. With regards to the roof of the structure, we don't know whether it was thatched or whether it was hide, but we had two substantial internal post holes that would have held posts that would have supported that roof structure. And then the entrance to the structure itself was on the northwestern end of the house. So it's kind of tempting then to look at that house structure and kind of look at that kind of two-roomed kind of area to see, do they have any kind of differences for function? I suppose would one have been a living space or one kind of a sleeping space or something like that? Now, I suppose in common to all kind of Neolithic houses, there was no internal hearth, so we can't say for sure that one area was kind of the main kind of living space, or that the sleeping quarters might have been in the other kind of room. But it is interesting that in that first room closest to the entrance, it's almost kind of like the internal features that we identified. There's a series of post holes within that area that seem to divide that area into kind of three equal spaced kind of areas. So whether activities were going on inside the house that needed access to light coming in is certainly maybe a possibility, or again, we could be looking at a structure that had a kind of an upper floor that might have been used for storage or kind of a sleeping space. And I think that's been suggested from other findings across the country with regards to the Neolithic in Ireland. But yeah, so I suppose the artifacts that were recovered, we had a substantial amount of pottery, carinated ware, which are kind of round bottom bowls. And these seem to be kind of domestic items. And then in addition, we had a series of flint artifacts, scrapers, that would have been used for processing of carcasses and stuff like that in kind of everyday use. So that's kind of gives us an idea of maybe what kind of activities were being carried out in and around the kind of house and in kind of Riley. And I suppose we came across a lot of charred hazelnut shells. So we know that hazelnuts were being gathered in the surrounding areas, and they would have provided also an important kind of foodstuff. So I suppose that's kind of the general kind of makeup of the house, and it's kind of interesting to look at kind of the Neolithic in, I suppose, Wexford prior to this, because really the only evidence we had were the locations of Mesolithic tombs, I suppose, places where the Neolithic peoples were burying their dead, but we didn't have any evidence of where they were living. Like, I mean, if people are building tombs, it kind of suggests that there's a substantial population in the area, and this population must be living and working the land. So to come across the find is absolutely spectacular, yeah, of the house itself. So interestingly, the construction of the house, the kind of split planks seem to have been concentrated at the northwestern end, and then the kind of the post holes and possibly the wattle screens were identified at the southwestern end, and the construction methods reflect the kind of two-room structure, so to speak. So again, are we looking at something there that the kind of the front of the house required kind of separate building materials, or was constructed in a different way towards the back end of the house, or were different activities carried out at either end? I suppose we did identify two large pits in that kind of southeastern room, which were filled with a lot of hazelnut shells. But this activity seems to have been undertaken at a time when the house had kind of gone out of its main kind of phase of use. And again, this is something that's commonly identified on Neolithic houses in Ireland, that there's a lot of, we'll say, deposition that occurs of the material culture towards the end of the life cycle of the house, where kind of the end of the house, or the end of use of the house, is kind of marked by depositing the kind of daily items, the pottery and other kind of artifacts at that time. So there's kind of some artifacts that we found at the front of the house that seem to mark the beginning of the structure. So we've got some scrapers, 2 disc scrapers, I think, that were found within the kind of the floor of the house in that first room, and we also had some quartz crystal debitage that was found in there. So whether there's some kind of ceremony going on that kind of marks the beginning of the house, and then towards the end, we seem to have the everyday items that were deposited maybe towards the end of the life cycle of the house as well. I suppose the other interesting finding from the house was that we came across evidence that maybe the house had been kind of burnt down towards the end of the life cycle of the house, with a lot of oxidized clay, certainly towards the northwestern end of the house. So it does suggest that maybe the house was deliberately decommissioned. And again, that's a finding that's common enough. That has been found in other sites or other Neolithic houses across Ireland. So that's the I suppose the summary of the findings of the Neolithic house at Riley 2, and it kind of, I suppose, it gives us a picture of the group that were occupying that area, and the activities that they would have been involved in.
Thank you very much. That's comprehensive, and if you're watching the YouTube version of this, we'll have some images of this coming up as well. So do get over to our YouTube channel for that. So James Eogan, just on that amazing find, and then the other Neolithic activity, because I think a lot of the road schemes in the southeast of Ireland are uncovering quite a lot of, or more at least, Neolithic evidence there. So if just anything on that would be really interesting. Thanks.
Yes, thanks, Tom. Look, I think the really exciting thing when James and his team uncovered the remains of the house at Ryleen was that it was the first time that we had evidence for a house associated with these earliest agriculturalists that would have lived in Wexford. And it is amazing to think that, 6 millennia later, that the majority of people in Wexford, still make their living from farming and agriculture. The pottery that James referred to, these very distinctive, now obviously all that survived were sherds of pots. We didn't have any intact pots, but they're a very distinctive type of pottery associated with the early Neolithic in Ireland. These kind of shallow bowls with very distinctive shoulder and a slightly inturned rim. Let's say the research that Jessica Smith has done in terms of the organic residues that are preserved in the fabric of those pots shows, that they were used in the main for processing dairy products. So again, there's a huge focus in Southeast Ireland in terms of the agricultural economy on, particularly in the last decade or so, the expansion of dairy, and the modern farmers in Wexford and Kilkenny in a way are only following, the lead of their Neolithic forebears. The broader kind of landscape context is also very interesting, because we do have evidence again from Southeast Ireland, particularly a very well-dated pollen core from Lough Cullen in South County Kilkenny, only about 13 kilometres from the bypass project, which does show that those stone axes that are one of the ubiquitous finds associated with the early Neolithic period in Ireland, and up until now were the main evidence, apart from megalithic tombs, for the presence of early Neolithic farmers. So those stone axes were used for cutting down and clearing woodlands to create fields in which the farmers could graze their livestock, and also plant cereal crops, because there is charred cereal remains from the Ryleen house as well, both barley and wheat. So it wasn't just entirely focused on dairying. Intriguingly, of course, or maybe disappointingly rather than intriguingly, the nature of the soils in this part of Wexford is such that unburnt bone doesn't survive. So we don't actually, and none of the features excavated by James and the team at Ryleen contained any evidence for animal bone, sadly. So we don't actually have the remains of livestock that people might have either eaten or as they used for dairying purposes. In terms of the broader context, then you can imagine the Ryleen house, sitting in maybe what you might think of as kind of a reverse oasis, almost, kind of surrounded by woodland, this little maybe island of cleared land, on this, nice kind of terrace overlooking the Magdalen stream, surrounded, by fields, in which there was livestock grazing, and then, in the summer, cereal crops ripening and so on. But the woodland was all around it, because again, we're talking, while it based on the quantity of finds and the number of sites dated in the Neolithic period, there must have been a significant increase in population associated with the change in agricultural economy. These were still, small scale and probably, isolated communities. We don't, at this time in Ireland, we're not talking about kind of clustered villages. It's, one-off houses. And probably single families farming in a particular locality. And one of the interesting is that also at Ryleen, but at a different site in the same townland, there was evidence uncovered for the reuse by the early Neolithic period of the tree throw holes, so after a tree has blown over, if you imagine the root ball, creates this nice little kind of hollow, and if it falls the right way, that kind of almost creates a natural shelter. So these people, while they were farming and while they were carrying agriculture, they were still very much engaging with the wild wood, and undoubtedly would have obtained the evidence of the hazelnut shells that the James referred to, shows that they were obtaining resources from those natural habitats and so on. So they weren't totally ignoring their surroundings, and we can also see, as James referenced, the design of the house excavated at Ryleen is very similar to the design of every other early Neolithic house that we know of in Ireland. Details in the design change and so on, but the general layout and size is well matched. So again, these communities, while they were, probably individual farming families, they had a way of building that was common across the island of Ireland at that time. So we can imagine that they were in contact with other communities, elsewhere in, the catchment, let's say, of the River Barrow or its tributaries, or maybe even further afield.
And both your answers there, I think, I'm sure Luke will agree, very evocative when you're talking about the tree bowls and user shelters, and you're talking about the hazelnut shells as well. I think to get that idea of its people, it's very easy to have this sort of abstract view of the past as a foreign country, but I think I'm sure Luke, you agree that that's something that sort of resonates with us and hopefully with our listeners as well.
Yeah, it's brilliant for me as a non-archaeologist. The picture you're painting here, I can see it. You can see these people. You can kind of, get a view of how they lived, which I suppose is the purpose of doing work like this, to get that kind of link between here and then. And
I think, moving again, this book is about places for living and places for the dead, and now we're moving on to the next period where the dead sort of feature more heavily in the Bronze Age. So again, we'll start with James Hession and then go over to James Eogan. But could you talk about the early Bronze Age and Middle Bronze Age evidence that you have for burials and dying, and how the complexity of society is that they're creating sort of ever more sort of interesting ways of interpreting people's lives and views of the afterlife as well, and how we see that in the material culture. You're talking earlier about the carinated bowls, so the ceramics that are being associated with these burials and are in many ways the archaeologist's best friend. So James, if you could just talk a little bit about the Bronze Age evidence.
Sure. I suppose just with regards to the early Bronze Age, we had two kind of cemetery sites there at Stokestown 2 and Cameron 3. I suppose the site at Stokestown 2 there consisted of kind of three cremations that possibly associated with a small ring ditcher, kind of like an enclosure area for those burials. I suppose the interesting thing about the kind of early Bronze Age is that there seems to be a kind of a set of kind of cultural norms with regards to how individuals are kind of are buried. Although there's kind of you do come across kind of inhumation burials as well. The burials that we came across were cremations. So we had two cremations in kind of in stone-lined kist or a stone-lined kind of box, and one in a kind of a simple pit. And I suppose one of the burials within the stone-lined kist was interned in an inverted encrusted urn. and that was an adult male. And yeah, it's just kind of really interesting that people in the early Bronze Age were cremating individuals and then interring them within these kind of areas, within a vessel, in a certain kind of type of way, where they're inverting the vessel or turning it upside down. And the pit burial was an individual that was interned in a kind of bipartite vase, which is a certain type of early Bronze Age vessel. And on those funerary vessels, there was a lot of kind of, I suppose, decoration. There was incised lines kind of around the opening or the mouth of each of those kind of vessels. And the burial at Camlin 3, this one was again just a burial that was kind of placed within a simple pit. It might have had a stone kind of placed over the top of it, but the interesting thing here is that it seems to be placed beside a large boulder. Now, whether this was a kind of a grave marker or kind of something like that, we're not too sure, but it probably could have been seen from the kind of lower slopes. So the idea there is that maybe that's kind of placed there for people to kind of see as a kind of a marker in the landscape. Whereas at Stonestown 2, there mightn't be as much of a kind of visual representation, I suppose, of those burials in the landscape, certainly from any kind of distance. But they both seem to be kind of placed within the kind of the same kind of area. They're both positioned overlooking kind of rivers. That seems to be a kind of common theme in the early kind of Bronze Age, that we just have a small number of individuals that they're kind of overlooking a kind of a river or place along kind of a natural kind of boundary. And moving to the kind of early or the Middle Bronze Age finds at Camlin 4 and at Berkeley 3, the Middle Bronze Age, the cremation, although that remains the dominant rite, we rarely get individuals interned in complete vessels. So what we have is just sherds of pottery might be included in the burial, but we also get a new kind of a tradition or a token burial, they're called, because only a partial amount of the cremated bone is interred within these simple pits. So it's at both Camlin 4 and Berkeley 3, we've had a longer period of burial. So we have Bronze Age populations or groups using these areas to inter the dead over an extended period. And we also have kind of a nice kind of sequence of events with regards to the excavation. We know we've got a number of individuals that seem to be interred first. Then we seem to have an introduced kind of silty clay that's placed over these burials. And then at a slightly later time, further individuals are buried within this area, and they're dug through that kind of sealing deposit. So we've a really nice kind of sequence of events, tight stratigraphic kind of nature of the findings there. Where we've kind of, three kind of main kind of phases. But also, what we kind of find with the burials at Camlin and Berkeley is that we seem to have a bit of a kind of a variational kind of change, whereas the inclusion of kind of grave goods or kind of personal ornaments doesn't really continue from the early Bronze Age into the Middle Bronze Age period. But there seems to be maybe a little bit of regional variation here in Wexford, where we came across a number of kind of stone beads that seem to have been included with the burials at Camlin 4. So these are kind of another kind of first finding from the excavations on the road scheme, where we've got a phyllite bead or certainly a bead or a toggle or something like that that's been included with one of the burials. So it's just a small fragment of a I suppose a broken bead or toggle with a kind of a central perforation in kind of elongated hole. And then in the third phase of activity at that site, we have another kind of similar type toggle again, or beach, or kind of maybe whether it had a number of perforations through it, and that was kind of recovered from the later phase of activity in that kind of case. So it's kind of interesting to look at those kind of sites and to kind of see that although there's like a broad keeping with the cultural norms from the rest of the Bronze Age finds across the Ireland, there does seem to be a little bit of regional variance there with regards to the findings at Cameron 4 and Berkeley 3. So that's kind of just a broad kind of breakdown of the findings from those cemetery sites. Again, I suppose the locations of the Middle Bronze Age cemeteries, they're maybe kind of slightly more elevated kind of locations. And again, there's the idea that these areas are certainly classified as suitable areas to kind of inter the dead. There's certainly, different areas that are used for industrial activity or working practices compared to where you would bury the dead and to where the actual settlement evidence is. But these areas do seem to be kind of clustered in kind of these areas where people are living, working and dying across dying in that kind of landscape.
Thank you. Yeah, and James Eogan, just your thoughts on that. It's really interesting. Thanks.
Yeah, so I suppose the interesting thing is we spoke earlier about the idea that the Mesolithic people were the first people to make places in this landscape, and in a way we see a development of that in the Bronze Age, and it involves places being made for the dead, but also those places most definitely having a significance for the living. And as James pointed out, we can observe some patterns in terms of the placement of the dead in the landscape, and so the earlier burials are do seem to be closely related with natural boundaries and even routeways in the context of the Camlin burial beside prominent stone, which seems to be along a natural route kind of up over Camlin Hill. Interestingly, the burials at Stokestown, their topographic location very closely reflects the topographic location of similar early Bronze Age burials that were found just a little bit downriver in Dunganstown in the 1850s. That site also, seems to have contained at least two burials on kind of a little terrace or plateau overlooking the River Barrow. So you can almost imagine that, these were the ancestors being placed as kind of sentinels, maybe on the boundary of the territory of the people who lived in this area. The Middle Bronze Age cemeteries then are fascinating in a different way in terms of kind of their territorial context or their landscape context, because again we know from the examination of the pollen core from Lough Cullen that those burials are contemporary with a phase of really significant woodland clearance in the catchment of the Lough Cullen pollen core. Now, as I say, it's only about 13 kilometres away, so it's not unrealistic to extrapolate from that pollen core that there was a similar pattern in the kind of the New Ross area. So if we imagine that, in the Bronze Age, we have a growing population, we've a significant expansion of what you might call the settled landscapes. So in other words, farmland and so on, and potentially, that gave rise to, let's say, disputes between adjacent communities and so on. This is my land. No, this is my land. And in a way, you can envisage these cemeteries maybe as a way of communities staking a claim to a particular area. And James referenced the fact that, again, one of the really distinctive things about the Middle Bronze Age in Ireland is the emergence of this practice of burial of token deposits of cremated bone. So in the early Bronze Age period, let's say the burial at Camlin, like, you know, there was over a kilo of cremated bone. You know, virtually the entire skeleton was, you know, packed into the pot that was buried in Camlin. In contrast, you know, the Middle Bronze Age cemetery in Camlin, as James said, uphill from the early Bronze Age burial, and the Middle Bronze Age cemetery at Berkeley, the deposits of cremated bone there, you know, were literally handfuls, you know, maybe 30, 40, 50 grams of bone. So a tiny fraction of the amount of bone. Kind of hard for us as modern people to envisage why you just kind of, you know, yeah, Dad is dead, I'll put a handful of them here and I'll drop another handful of them over there, sort of thing. But this is the practice that people had in the Middle Bronze Age. And it may well be that there were a whole series of these cemeteries, maybe, you know, in newly reclaimed or newly cleared land, and that this was the way that the community had of literally staking their claim to the territory. In the same way that in, you know, other parts of Ireland, you know, there's very significant evidence for, let's say, the deposition of hoards or metalwork, let's say, in you know, riverine or wetland locations, bogs and so on. Obviously, we don't have bogs in the southeast, so, you know, you can't deposit metalwork in the bogs. But maybe we're seeing a kind of it's not the same practice, but maybe it's a related practice in terms of the creation of these cemeteries containing multiple deposits, multiple small deposits of, you know, the cremated bone of, you know, recently dead members of the community. And what's really significant about the Camlin and Berkeley cemeteries, and James referenced it there, is that, you know, they're the only two Middle Bronze Age cemeteries in Ireland where we have very good evidence for stratigraphic sequencing. And in fact, even in Britain, this is a very rare, you know, discovery. And what that has enabled us to do, because the excavation was done so carefully and was so well recorded, you know, we've been able to date samples from the early phase of burials, and we've been able to date samples from the later phase of burials, and using, you know, the advanced computational capacity that's now available through computers, and, you know, adopting, you know, approaches like Bayesian statistical analysis, stuff that, to be honest, I don't even fully understand. But, you know, what that shows is that, like, you know, those initial early burials probably took place maybe over the space of 1 or 2 generations, no more than about 60 years. And then they were covered. And so, you know, this burial place was marked. And what's very interesting then is that the evidence is that, you know, maybe over the following 2 centuries, so then there was another series of burials put into the deposit that covered the early burials. So here we can see this, it isn't just a once-off, you know, event, but this is a sequence of activity presumably carried out by many generations, you know, living in this area, and basically that this was, you know, the place for the dead, and this is where the dead were placed, and those dead then played a role in the ongoing life of the living in the community. So the significance of the cemeteries at Camlin and Berkeley, you know, really can't be underestimated for, you know, our kind of conception or understanding of Middle Bronze Age society in Ireland, and is a real, you know, it's a very significant contribution from the work that was done by the Rubicon team on the New Ross Bypass.
Yeah, thank you for that. And again, it reflects the strength of the book that's in the title, Places for the Living, Places for the Dead. We've got an amazing, I don't know, deadscape, or there's probably a better term for that in funerary archaeologists. But I think now, I think look, it's a good idea because it's such a good book and I enjoyed reading it so much that we'll skip to a final section, and I want to talk about the living, just to finish off. And I want to talk about another sort of unique site that you discovered, and that's a low status late medieval farmstead that was discovered as well. And often these sort of discoveries, the later medieval ones, can get lost. We all love Vikings, we all love prehistoric. Sometimes later medieval can get lost, but I don't think this should get lost because it's so well written up and so well excavated. Could just to sort of finish off, could both of you just talk about? I'll start with James Hession again on this, about this sort of unique survival of a low status later medieval farmstead.
Yeah, sure. So the farmstead is Landscape 2A is a really kind of special site. I suppose in terms of the quantity and level of preservation was actually very good, and that isn't something that we kind of come across all too often. Generally, when we come across, I suppose, medieval kind of farmsteads, there's usually kind of just maybe one structure, or where there are more than one structure. Sometimes that can kind of signify that there was kind of like multiple phases of use at the site, and the two weren't kind of contemporary. But at Landscape 2A, we seem to have the whole farmstead. We've got 5 structures that were, for all intents and purposes, contemporary. So just off, just on the I suppose down from Canman Hill there, you've got a settlement consisting of kind of 5 planned structures. So we've got probably a cottage, or the kind of the main kind of farmstead kind of area. We've certainly got a kind of a workshop kind of to the south of that. We seem to have an area maybe where hay was stored, a hayrick, or possibly a poultry house maybe to the west of that. We've got a large kind of barn structure over on the other kind of part of the site, and at the east of that again, we seem to have an animal enclosure, or possibly like a sheep pen, or an area where sheep were being penned at night. So like the site itself, I suppose we've got really defined structures. Certainly the cottage and kind of the barn structure, we've got the outline of where the clay walls would have stood, and they're defined again by a kind of an outer, I suppose a drip trench, or an area where I suppose the main thing for clay walled buildings is that you kind of have to have a way of keeping the water away from them. So these kind of drainage features kind of define the extent of the house. But yeah, so the settlement then, like to the north of it, we even seem to have kind of the remnants of a metalled roadway. So we even have the kind of the way in and out of the site itself. And the dates that came back would certainly seem to suggest that all the sites or all the structures are contemporary with each other. There was a bit of anomaly of some kind of later dates, but that isn't reflected in the material culture of the pottery that was recovered. It all seems to be that we are looking at something kind of in around the kind of the mid 12th to kind of 14th kind of century. And yeah, the cottage structure one is I suppose you really get the sense that this is a place for the living, because you've kind of got a 2-room structure there. You can kind of see where the entrance to the structure was by the post holes on the northern wall. You still have this sunken floor. You had a plethora of internal kind of stake holes and post holes that kind of show that different areas were being used. That you had kind of areas where were kind of divided off, whether they were used for kind of storage or kind of what was happening there. We don't know, but it's certainly the internal space is kind of divided up. We had a double kind of hearth feature and hearth stone, so we know that people are living on that side of the house. And then on the other side, we seem to have evidence that maybe animals were housed in that side of the house. We've got a lintel drain running from the internal area towards the outside. So I suppose the house has a lot of characteristics similar to the medieval longhouse that would be encountered in the UK. It's the same for structure 4, the kind of the main barn kind of area. Again, we've got that the evidence of the clay wall of the structure. We seem to have an area to the rear of that might have functioned as a pigsty or a kind of an animal enclosure. And we have the entrance to that structure on the western wall, so it would have kind of opened up into the kind of courtyard kind of space. So you can get a really good picture of what this farmstead looks like, I suppose, from the ground plan alone. And it was a really interesting site. And then combined with the research that Margaret Murphy and James Galloway carried out, their kind of research seems to suggest that this area, although it's on the manor of Old Ross, it's right in the periphery. Like if it was any further on the edge, it would be right into the marshland itself or into the rivers. And they've kind of looked at the place name evidence, and it kind of shows that this was an area of kind of mixed English and Irish settlement, with a lot of, we'll say, the unfree peasants living in this area, and they would have been associated with kind of livestock husbandry. So it throws up a kind of an interesting question that are we looking at I suppose an Irish settlement, or are we looking at the colonists coming over and setting up, and is it a kind of an English settlement? I suppose looking at the direct comparisons, you'd probably see more similar kind of style and structure from UK examples, but the place name evidence and its location would kind of almost point that it may be a kind of an area of Irish peasant settlement within I suppose within the manor, within the Anglo-Norman controlled area. And we know that the native Irish made up a lot of the population of these manors and would have been involved in the daily kind of working lives of these areas. It's just that we very rarely come across evidence of where these people lived. So that's just the initial intro into the site. But I don't know if James wants to take it up there and talk more about it, and I can kind of come back in towards the end or something.
I suppose the really interesting thing, as James Hession just explained there, is that this is the best preserved example we have of a late medieval peasant settlement in Ireland, and most fully excavated to date. And what's really important about the site is that so much of our knowledge of the Anglo-Norman colony is based on the well-preserved sites, like the Motte of Old Ross, which was located at the centre of the manor of Old Ross, where the lord of the manor would have lived with his retinue, and where there would have been a mill and a parish church and so on. Obviously, we then have the remains associated with the medieval town of New Ross, St. Mary's Church and the other well-known medieval features of New Ross. But of course, those sites, while they would have been experienced by ordinary people and would have been built by ordinary people, were not the places that the ordinary people lived. So, the settlement uncovered that landscape is really significant from that perspective, because it gives us a really important insight into the daily life of the ordinary people, and this the lives of these people weren't recorded in the historical documentation that we have. So this is a period where we do have historical documentation, and in fact there's very significant historical documentation surviving for the manor of Old Ross. There's manorial accounts and so on. So the economic kind of fortunes of the manor can be reconstructed from the documentary evidence. But again, the documentary evidence only hints at the people that contributed to the economy of the manor, the ordinary people that contributed to the economy of the manor, and is more concerned with tallying up the accounts for the lord, in terms of how much money they were making off the sheep they were raising and the crops they were growing and so on. It's only research archaeologists we could spend a lifetime looking for or searching for a site like the landscape settlement. And it will be very difficult to find using traditional archaeological techniques, because, as James described, the nature of the buildings that were built here, they're built of wood and earth, and they don't leave any above ground trace. So it was only because of the extensive nature of the excavations, the investigative excavations that were undertaken in advance of construction of the bypass, that uncovered these remains. And then, James and his team were able to spend the necessary amount of time to fully excavate and investigate the site. So again, it's a very significant site, and is the sort of site, or is a site, I'm sure, that for years to come, people are going to be referring to it as a type site for late medieval low status settlement in Ireland. And the debate will go on in terms of how to interpret. Is it an Irish settlement, or is it a colonist settlement, or is it maybe a mixture of both, and so on. So, but a really significant addition to our understanding of late medieval society in the hinterland of the medieval town of New Ross.
And thank you so much. And I think, look, you can't get any better than sort of finishing off on a type site. I think if you hit that, then that's the mother load. And I think the important points both Jameses were talking about there, this giving the voice to the voiceless, and a project that without this major linear infrastructure project, without the roadway, we wouldn't have found this. So again, showing what major projects do in terms of transport and TII, and what commercial archaeology can bring to it as well, and discovering a site type like this. So I think everyone has got to get off and actually do their jobs and do more archaeology. So Luke and I won't keep you anymore. Just to say thank you very much to James Hession. Thank you very much to James Eogan for your time, and also for the work that you and your teams have done on this project and on this amazing book, Places for the Living, Places for the Dead. We'll talk about that more in the outro. And yeah, it's a fantastic publication, so do seek it out. But thank you from myself and on behalf of Red River Archaeology Group and Rubicon Heritage. And I'll leave it to Luke to say his thank yous as well.
Yeah, thanks very much, guys. I'm sure anyone like myself who might know a lot about this now have a big interest in it, and will hopefully go out and seek out the book and find out a little bit more about it. Thanks so much for coming on.
No bother. You're welcome, Tom. You're welcome, Luke. And glad to know that you found the book interesting.
Thank you very much. Thanks, guys.
That was great. Yeah.
Thanks, everyone.
Brilliant.
And I think I always say this, and I always say this, that was great. I enjoyed it. It's a privilege to be a presenter on this podcast, and it was just again, I think going back to what I said at the intro, the fact you've got editors that have got this overview, and they could take us through the landscapes going from the Mesolithic to the modern day into the medieval period, where we've got this amazing low status farmstead, complete find of that. The early Neolithic house as well. Lots of first. The book itself is so beautiful. If you're watching on YouTube again, you'll have seen those images as well. Look, I loved it, and I presume it was the same for you.
It was incredible. It's these are these kinds of things that when I came into this job, having no real background in it, I wasn't sure how I'd find these things interesting, but they constantly interest me, amaze me, surprise me, because like it says that there are places for the living, places for the dead. That's exactly what this is. It's about people, is what this always is, and how people live, and how what we discover today basically relates back to what was happening back then. And it's incredible to me that archaeologists like yourselves are able to figure all this stuff out and put these stories and put these puzzles together. And it's fascinating and incredible to read books, listen to conversations between these people, because it's fascinating.
Yeah, and as I'll leave it to Luke to close out, because he remembers all the channels that we're on, and I don't all the time. But I just thank you for listening, and watch this space for further content to come from the Places for the Living for the Dead, Places for Living, Places for the Dead book, and the project, and the archaeology. So there's more to come. Watch this space, and I hope you enjoyed it.
Before we wrap up, I just want to give a fond farewell to this printer that's behind me. It served Rubicon Heritage, and as a result, the Red River Archaeology Group very well for, I think, 14 years now. It's done. It's gone. It's going to the
I imagine it was integral to Places for the Living, Places for the Dead.
I'd imagine so.
Yeah.
But it's now going to the Places for the Dead, unfortunately. To the big office in the sky.
Check out
So can we all give a round of applause to this lovely printer? But thanks so much for listening, guys. Thanks so much for watching. This is The Shindig. If you liked what you saw, if you liked what you heard, leave us a comment, leave us a question, let us know what you want to see. Follow us on X, follow us on Instagram, follow us on Facebook, leave a comment under the YouTube video, and make sure to hit subscribe so that you can get more Shindig episodes into your ears, onto your computers whenever they're released. My name is Luke Barry.
My name is Tom Horn, and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you.